Hello, my name is Emily Steimel, and I am the Public Education Coordinator at the YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment. Today, we are going to be discussing an overview of how trauma affects the brain functioning and development, the regulation of the body, the encoding and consolidation of memory, and the individual's behavior. By the end of today's session, you will have more knowledge and understanding of the physical, neurobiological responses to trauma, so you can provide trauma-informed care and services to victims and survivors of trauma. The YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment, formerly known as the Battered Women's Task Force, provides free and confidential services to victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking in Shawnee, Jackson, Wabaunsee, and Brown counties in Kansas. All services that we provide at the Center for Safety and Empowerment, from our emergency safe shelter to our food and hygiene product pantry, counseling, and case management, are always going to come from an empowerment-based, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed approach. We also provide other options and services for survivors, such as some material and financial assistance when available, help with filing protection orders, responding to survivors at the hospital, and more. Advocates are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year via our 24-hour helpline at 1-888-822-2983. So we want to start off by defining what trauma is. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is perceived by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Most people associate trauma with events like active combat military, a natural disaster, or an accident. Domestic and sexual violence may not always be the first example of trauma that we think of. However, trauma can be more accurately described as any distressing event that falls beyond the scope of normal human experience. We have all experienced trauma, but there are two main categories of trauma, commonly referred to as big T and little t trauma. Big T traumas are the events most commonly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This includes serious injury accidents, sexual violence, and life-threatening experiences. Any event that threatens one's life or bodily integrity is a big T traumatic experience, even if the person is never physically harmed or if a weapon wasn't involved. Little t traumas are highly distressing events that affect individuals on a personal, emotional level, but don't necessarily fall into the big T category. Examples of little t trauma include non-life-threatening injuries, emotional abuse, death of a pet, bullying and harassment, divorce, loss of a significant relationship, experiencing poverty and housing instability, living with someone with mental health struggles, and addiction. Although little t traumas may not always meet the criteria for a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, these events can still cause significant emotional damage, particularly if an individual experiences more than one event or if these traumas occur during important periods of brain development. Evidence now concludes that repeated exposure to little t traumas can actually cause more harm than exposure to a single big T traumatic event. What is important to take away here is that trauma, big or little, is extremely prevalent in our world and has the ability to impact development, perceptions, experiences, and the way a person navigates the world. Empathy and acceptance for the impact of trauma is crucial. Minimizing the impact of traumatic events can create adverse coping behaviors and may lead to cumulative damage over time. So speaking of perception, let's play a few perception games. Looking at this picture, you may see the dress as either white and gold or blue and black. Same with the next image. You may see a bird, a goat, or maybe you even see both. Just like the pictures, trauma and the way that we experience trauma is completely based on perception. Just because you may see the images differently than another does not mean that you are right or wrong. It just means that you are seeing the pictures differently based on your perceptions, your past experiences, your filters, and the way your brain works. How we experience, process, navigate, and cope with trauma is going to be unique from person to person and experience to experience. The key to understanding the impact of trauma is to examine how it affects that individual rather than focusing on the event itself. We do not get to choose which response we have to trauma, and we have no control over how our brain and body respond to trauma. This is because our brain turns off the part of it that is in charge of higher level of thinking, turns off our ability to utilize our normal coping skills, and it turns all of its energy to activating our basic survival reflexes to adapt, tolerate, and survive whatever traumatic experience is occurring. Trauma changes the biology of our brains, and it impacts our bodies physically, emotionally, behaviorally, and cognitively. Take some time to look over this graphic and the symptoms that may come from trauma. These behaviors can cloud our judgment regarding the individual we are working with if we do not understand trauma. We know that one traumatic event can change our brains and our bodies. As we go through the information today, I also want you to think about how this can impact someone with complex or compounded trauma, someone who has experienced multiple traumas, and the long-term emotional, mental, and physical changes that can bring. We also have to take into consideration that trauma does not happen in a vacuum. This means that trauma is survived on top of other hardships that someone may be going through, or other traumas that they may be going through at the same time, such as poverty and housing instability, death, incarceration, other forms of violence, mental health issues, addiction, etc. So now we're going to look at some different parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma. The first one that we're going to look at is the prefrontal cortex. It is located in the front of your brain, and this is our thinking center. It is in charge of higher level of thinking and executive functions. It helps us to understand, process, and problem solve. You'll see responsibilities of the prefrontal cortex listed on this slide. This area of the brain is where we want to live out of. When this area of the brain is strong and healthy, we are able to think clearly, make good decisions, and be aware of ourselves and others. This area of the brain also helps us to set and maintain goals, curb our negative impulses, organize events in time order, and even form individual personalities. However, it is also the part of the brain that is not fully developed until age 25 or 26. This means that any trauma that occurs from birth to age 25 and 26 has the potential to significantly disrupt typical neurodevelopmental processes, and this can contribute to long-term life-changing consequences. In a traumatized person, their thinking center is underactivated. High level of arousal chemicals are poured into the bloodstream, causing poor impulse control, poor judgment, mood changes, and a decrease in reasoning ability. Individuals who are traumatized may notice difficulties with concentration and attention, and often report that they have a hard time thinking clearly. The second part of the brain that we're going to look at is the amygdala, our fear center, the oldest part of the brain. This part of the brain is survival centered and is responsible for our fight, flight, and freeze response. It is also in charge of processing emotion, reactions, and threats. The responsibility of the amygdala is to filter through all incoming information to answer one question: is this a threat or a perceived threat? If a threat or a perceived threat is detected, it produces fear in us by dumping hormones into our bloodstreams so that we feel afraid, reactive, and vigilant. This is so that we can act in a way that will help save our life, to maintain our safety and survival. The amygdala is constantly scanning our environment for threats and remembering previous threats. It records those previous threats so that it has an increased, quicker reaction time. Its main function is to make quick, split-second decisions without thinking through the options and consequences so that we can survive whatever threat we are facing. In someone who has experienced trauma, they can develop an enlarged amygdala or a fear center that is overactivated. This creates an overproduction of stress hormones. Since acute stress reactions are nearly constant in the lives of those suffering from trauma, adrenaline is overproduced. A buildup of adrenaline can lead to withdrawal, anxiety, depression, aggression, and delinquent behaviors. It also creates an underproduction of neurotransmitters. Oftentimes, a traumatized person's brain is bottom heavy, meaning that activations of lower, more primitive areas, including the fear center, are high, while higher areas of the brain, known as cortical areas, are underactivated. The person may experience chronic stress, vigilance, fear, and irritation. They may also have a hard time feeling safe, calming down, or sleepy. These symptoms are all a result of a hyperactive amygdala. This can cause distorted or altered thinking. They may begin to ruminate and obsess. Everywhere they look, there is danger. Even during times that others would not perceive as threatening, someone with a traumatized amygdala may perceive the situation differently, causing the amygdala to dump those chemicals into the bloodstream to react to that crisis or emergency situation that they may seem as life-threatening. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the anterior cingulate cortex, or the emotion regulation center. This part of the brain helps us to balance between the stimulus and the feeling. So is my feeling equal to the situation or the experience? Am I feeling what is reasonable in the context of that situation? If not, what is going on? The ACC is responsible for regulating emotion and has a close working relationship with the thinking center. When this region is strong and healthy, we are able to manage difficult thoughts and emotions without being totally overwhelmed by them. The emotion regulation center helps us think of consequences to actions and helps us manage our emotions so that we don't do things that we regret. However, when a brain has been altered by trauma, the ability to emotionally regulate has been impacted, making it impossible for that person to move through reasonable reactions. The emotion regulation center is underactivated. Trauma creates disconnect from feelings, as well as produces feelings that don't match the situation. This can cause emotional dysregulation. The last part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the hippocampus, which we'll talk more about later on. The hippocampus is in charge of processing information into memories. If you saw a hippo on campus, you would remember it. First, the hippocampus encodes the memory. This means that the information is organized based on sensory information. Next, the memory is consolidated, which means that the information is grouped, stored, and labeled in our brains. Pretty easy. So we combine this all together and we have the brain-body response. At any moment in the day, we are taking in a variety of stimuli. When exposed to a non-threatening stimuli, you are receiving that information. You send some of that information to your cortex, which is in charge of your processing, your understanding, your higher level of thinking. You send some of that information to your hippocampus for memory storage, and then you send it to your amygdala for a response. And since this is a non-life-threatening stimuli, your amygdala would not be alerted. So you would not engage in a survival or a trauma response. This is a relatively slow process. So let's dive into what happens when we do encounter a perceived threat. Let's say you are on a walk and you come face to face with this bear in the woods. Your amygdala would automatically see that bear as a threat because of what our brains know about bears. And because the amygdala remembers information on threats and information on past threats. It will automatically recognize that we have to take action quickly if we want to survive this bear. We don't have time to think about our options or process consequences to those options. Those are all roles of our prefrontal cortex. We just have to act, and we have to act quickly. So let's go back to that same diagram and talk about what happens to it when we detect a bear in the woods. So we have our bear as our stimuli. Once again, this is going to be a threatening stimuli because of what we know and perceive about bears. So in order to act quickly, our brain has to cut off some really important functioning to save time and to put all of its energy to the amygdala for a response. So to do so, our brain has to cut off the cortex, that higher level of thinking. So I think about this in the sense of, if I'm going to go on a hike where I could potentially encounter a bear in the woods, I might Google search, or I might ask the ranger what to do if I see a bear in the woods. And I'm going to log that information. I'm supposed to do this, and I'm not supposed to do that. That is all information that is stored in our cortex and our higher level of thinking, an area that we don't have access to when we come face to face with a bear in the woods. So although you might think you know what you're going to do when you see a bear in the woods, when you're actually in that moment of threat, in that moment of trauma, all of that thinking kind of goes out the door, and you just do what you need to do to survive. The other part of the brain that is offline when we experience a threat or trauma is the hippocampus, the memory. This is why oftentimes survivors of trauma don't remember much of it, or it's a completely blacked out memory, it's a fuzzy memory, or they only remember bits and pieces of it. Because the hippocampus is impacted by the hormones that are dropped in the brain and the body during trauma. So during an experience of trauma, such as seeing a bear in the woods, our bodies take any action it can as a way to protect us from that potential harm. The response our bodies have depend on how severe we perceive that threat to be, who or what is causing us the threat, how much power we perceive that we have to take action, and our past responses to trauma. Remember, your amygdala keeps record of past trauma. So to act quickly, our brains cut off our cortex, what is in charge of our most complex thinking, problem solving, and determining consequences for actions. That is why victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence sometimes do things during trauma that don't quite make sense to someone who wasn't in that experience. Our brains also cut off our hippocampus, in charge of memory. And once again, that is oftentimes why victims and survivors of violence don't remember much about their trauma, or only remember bits and pieces. This is great when we see a bear in the woods. We want our brains to respond in this way. Nobody wants to be breakfast, lunch, or dinner to a bear in the woods. But when we think about this in the sense of domestic and sexual violence, we have to think about what would happen to us if the bear lives with us. The bear shares a bed or a room with us. The bear shares a dinner table with us. The bear works with us, goes to school with us. The bear is someone that we see every single day. When someone is constantly exposed to their perceived threat stimulus, or is constantly in and out of their trauma, their amygdala, their fear center, is constantly alerted, and their stress hormones are constantly elevated. Trauma impacts our body almost like a car that is constantly revving and accelerating its engine. When you rev and accelerate your engine all of the time, your system is going to exhaust out faster. This long term can have significant mental, emotional, and physical effects. It makes it harder for that person to utilize their normal coping mechanisms. It makes it harder for them to have a sense of control over themselves and their environment. It makes it harder for them to maintain connection and healthy relationship with others. It will impact their brains, their bodies, their perception, and their behaviors over and over and over again, which then compounds their trauma. When we experience trauma, a release of stress chemicals is triggered in the brain and released from our amygdala. These chemicals influence perception, reaction, and memory. These four chemicals are released in varying amounts, which can affect how individuals react during and after trauma. Some survivors may release all, one, or any combination of these stress chemicals. The first one is catecholamines. This hormone is one of the building blocks for our body's natural adrenaline to help pump our bodies up so that we can move in the face of a threat. This is the hormone that would help somebody possibly fight off an attacker or flee a situation. This chemical is also why you hear stories of people being able to lift cars off others who are trapped underneath. In the face of trauma, sometimes we can do some pretty superhuman things. Cortisol steroids work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy that person will have available to them, depending on how elevated their blood pressure gets. So some people will have a lot of energy and they will be able to fight back or flee, and they will likely stay very pumped up even after the assault. Other people don't have a lot of access to energy or adrenaline because this hormone sort of bottoms or flattens out. This may cause someone to freeze during an assault, or they may be in sort of a stupor after the assault with a very flat affect, very lethargic. The third one is opioids. Opioids are like our body's natural morphine. This is released in the body to block the individual from feeling physical pain. Because if our brains are too focused on feeling pain that we might have endured during trauma, then we will not have the focus we need to survive. This is why you hear stories of car crash victims or rock climbers or gunshot victims who were seriously injured but still managed to walk miles on miles, or they didn't even feel their injuries until they were able to have help and safety. We need this during a traumatic event. But the downside is that when opioids are blocking physical pain, they are also blunting and blocking other feelings and emotions, almost making someone go not only physically numb, but emotionally numb. This is why some survivors of domestic and sexual violence may recall not feeling anything or feeling drugged out or very out of it during an assault or incident of violence. When a survivor then recalls those events later, maybe when taking a report or talking to someone about what happened, they may describe the events with no affect or no emotion, almost like they are reciting off their grocery list. The last one is oxytocin. This is a hormone that promotes good feelings and connection. It is released during pleasurable consensual sex, childbirth, and breastfeeding. This is our cuddle hormone. It fuels connection between individuals and it creates bonds. This is why even though childbirth can be extremely painful and even sometimes very traumatic, people still continue to have children because the oxytocin floods through the body. They feel super connected and bonded to their child, and they forget about all of the pain that they just endured. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, why would our bodies release a chemical of good feeling during assault and violence? Once again, it comes back down to blocking and mitigating the pain of that assault, the physical pain and the psychological and emotional pain. Oxytocin is also the chemical that is responsible for a phenomenon called trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome, when a victim becomes bonded or attached to their abuser, perpetrator, or captor. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. The release of these hormones is compared to a hormonal bomb being released in the body, creating chaos and confusion and disrupting the normal hormonal balance within our bodies. So now we are going to watch an example of an uncontrollable response to trauma play out and the effects of the hormone bomb release. So we are going to be focusing on the young boy over here. And I do want you to be aware as we watch this video that there is a moment of explicit language at the end of the video. So please use caution as needed as you are viewing.
All right. I might yell just a little.
Okay. Well, okay. Okay. Well. Oh my God. Okay. I'm not. Okay. I'm a giant fella. Okay. It's okay. All is well. I lived a good life. Safety purposes. Heads back. Okay. Well, I. Fuck you! Holy smokes! Okay, all right, okay. Whoa! Okay, that was so bad. What happened? I think I blanked out. Okay, oh my God, I'm upside down! You said it didn't go upside down! You said it didn't go upside down! Oh, I get it down! Okay, sorry, so that wasn't so bad, was it? Oh, oh my God! Right, just, all right, I get it! Oh, okay, he's doing this on purpose. Okay, my legs, I lost feeling in them, okay? It's okay.
I'm still laughing. Oh my God.
Well, okay, okay, my legs don't work anymore. I think I left my lung up there.
What did you, why are you yelling? Oh, fuck.
How was that? Is that pretty cool? James, are you still with us? Now guys, just a question while you're strapped in, if you'd like to do one more, it's only $10 each. Go straight. Let's do it again.
Yeah.
Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Charge it on the car, babies.
So as you watched that video, you saw that he started to have a trauma response before the ride even took off. You might have heard him engaging in some self-soothing behaviors, singing to himself, telling himself that it would be okay, that he lived a good life. Then we saw the pump up of adrenaline as the ride took off, as he seemed excited, and you could see that in his body language. Then we saw the crash of the adrenaline when his body shut down and he passed out. That is like the body saying, I don't like this, it's painful, it hurts, it's scary, so we are going to shut down. That is a way that our brains and bodies protect us from further harm or further trauma. Then when we saw him come out of it, we know that he had no control over that response. One could tell by the limpness of his limbs that he had experienced as he passed out. But he also said, I think I just backed out. So that's once again telling us that he had no control over that response. And then he realizes the ride's going upside down. I don't like this. And his body shuts down again. And the second shutdown really had significant impact on his behavior. He was pretty out of it. He said some things like, I think I lost my lung up there. I can't feel my legs. That could be an indication of the opioids pumping through the bloodstream. Then he gets back to the ride operator station. And what does he say? He said, let's do it again. That can be connected back to the oxytocin, the trauma bonding, the connection. What we have to remember is that trauma completely overwhelms our capacity to utilize our normal coping skills. It floods the road to rational thought. It impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, process reactions, problem solve, and utilize our higher level decision-making skills. Our brain is completely overwhelmed when we experience trauma, and parts of it are completely offline. This inhibits our thinking and our judgment. Our behavior during and after a traumatic event depends solely on the levels of stress chemicals released. This is nothing that we have control over. It is just our brain doing what our brain does. And as mentioned earlier, trauma impacts our brain like a bomb, creating chaos, confusion, and devastation. The dust from that bomb can take up to 96 hours to settle. We know that during this time that the dust is still settling and our bodies are trying to desperately salvage what is left, survivors are still trying to live their lives, go about their days. That means that the effects of trauma go beyond our bodies. It follows us to work, to school, into our parenting, and beyond. Not only does the bomb explode during the initial trauma, but it also goes off every time the memory of that trauma is reactivated. Our brains cannot tell the difference between us having a memory of something traumatic and us actually being in that trauma. This is the response that is most often associated with triggers, flashbacks, and other symptoms of PTSD. A survivor's brain can be triggered at any time, maybe as they are recalling what happened to them during a rape kit exam, while filing a police report, while recounting on the witness stand, during consensual sex, by certain touches or movements, seeing their perpetrator or someone that looks like them or reminds them of that person. Even certain smells, sounds, and tastes can trigger a survivor's brain and trigger that traumatic memory. It's almost as if our brains think that if it can hold on to every little bit and piece of those scary memories and not let go of the feelings after that trauma, then maybe, just maybe, we can stay safe and we won't get hurt again. However, when someone is constantly remembering the event that hurt them, that can leave them feeling extremely numb, hypervigilant, worried, exhausted, frustrated, and can have an effect on their overall physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being. It's almost like the brain seems to pick and choose the memories and the feelings that it thinks are going to be most helpful for our survival. And it wants us to retain that information only. So I think about this in the way of thinking that during this webinar, you are trying to write down bits and pieces of information that you want to keep as notes. But instead of a tablet of paper or a computer, all you have to take notes on is a tiny stack of Post-it notes. Now, I want you to imagine that you are trying to write down all the notes from this webinar. And then I want you to gather up all of your notes and take them back to the world Messiest desk, because that's kind of what the inside of the human brain looks like. And I want you to take all those Post-it notes and scatter them all over the desk. Some on top, inside the drawers, the bottom, stuff them in random file folders and stacks of paper. Scatter them everywhere. Now imagine coming back to that messy desk 24 hours later, 96 hours later, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, whenever it is, and trying to find all of those Post-it notes, put them all in the correct order from beginning to end, and tell it back to someone else. It will probably take you a significantly long amount of time to complete this task, and your order and sequence of events will change throughout as you add things in and take things out, and you struggle to get them right in the right order, and you struggle to find all of your sticky notes. The information on the actual Post-it note is accurate and correct. What's messed up and what's messy is the recall. The recall is going to be a jumbled, disorganized mess. This is what we are asking victims and survivors to do when we question them, or when we ask them to recall their trauma or tell the story of their trauma. Because memory is so sensitive to the hormone changes that are caused by that trauma, trauma interferes with memory consolidation. So when the story comes out as varied, or it comes out as fragmented or sketchy or inconsistent, that does not necessarily mean that that person is making it up or over exaggerating or lying. This is evidence of trauma and the impact that trauma has on memory consolidation and memory encoding and recall. The brain is trying to reach way back into its matters and wrinkles and folds, grab the pieces of the experience so that they can try to put all of those pieces together to create one whole picture to give back to you. A picture that they oftentimes don't even understand or comprehend themselves. So I want you to think about an inconsistent story should alert you that something stressful or traumatic did in fact occur. And it should prompt you to contact appropriate resources and offer support and empathy so that that victim and survivor can be helped in getting their experience accurately reported. What sounds like deception may be due to trauma. And we talked earlier about the intersections of domestic violence and sexual violence, so let's dive into that a little bit more and how that kind of trauma can uniquely affect the brain and the victim's behavior. Based on information we have, things we have learned, things we have witnessed, past experiences, our brain creates maps, mapping some things to safety and some things like bears to danger. This is a survival mechanism in our brain so that when we are faced with that threat of danger, we are quicker to take action that will help protect us and keep us safe. Once again, this is a survival instinct. Another example is that we oftentimes map strangers to danger, and we map the people we love, trust, know, and care about, so our family, our friends, our significant others, to safety. But when we're talking specifically about domestic and sexual violence, the perpetrator is oftentimes someone we know and someone we have a relationship with, someone we care about, we love, we share memories, things, and maybe a family with. So when one of these people does something to hurt us, it causes confusion in our brain because we were taught that these people are safe, that they are not dangerous. And now I do not know what to do, and I don't know how to respond. So sometimes our brains and our bodies shut down as a way to protect us. I'm going to stay. I'm going to not fight back. I'm not going to call the police. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to justify. I'm going to deny. I'm going to find something that I did wrong to cause this because I am confused. Most often, bonding and attachment will override our threat circuitry until we are able to remap that person to danger, which oftentimes takes multiple threatening experiences with that person. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to trauma, it is important to talk about a phenomenon that we call trauma bonding. This occurs when oxytocin is released during that traumatic experience, causing that sensation of good feeling and connection, which then in turn causes that victim to become bonded to their abuser or their perpetrator. We know that abusers use tactics of fear and violence, along with times of care and kindness to create and reinforce trauma bonds. So through these cycles of abuse and trauma, that victim's brain releases oxytocin to help their bodies cope, to help mitigate and alleviate the physical and emotional harm being done. But with the release of that oxytocin, their brain also forms good feelings, connection, and attachment to the person causing the harm. These bonds are then reinforced by those periods of love, care, and affection that occur throughout abuse and violence. The constant release of oxytocin and the withholding and sharp increase of dopamine can cause a traumatized person's brain to almost become addicted to the high highs and the low lows and associate that cycle with love. Trauma bonding, in addition to many other factors, is why someone may not report the abuse, why they may lie about or minimize what is happening. They may be in denial or take responsibility for the abuse, and they may even protect the abuser. If we do not understand how trauma can impact a person's brain, then we will not understand the victim's behavior, which can cause us to jump to incorrect, harmful, and damaging conclusions. So how can this play out in trauma responses? As it turns out, fight, flight, and freeze is more complicated than originally thought. More recent studies suggest that a response is more like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Fawn is also known as our please and appease or tend and befriend response. So a survivor may be in constant fight or flight. I gotta get out of here. It's dangerous. The constant vigilance and arousal. Bad things are gonna happen to me because they have in the past. We might see anger and aggression in the fight response to trauma. Our flight response can look like someone mentally leaving their body, disassociating from the experience. Because if we perceive that we cannot physically leave, we will mentally leave. They may freeze like a possum, playing dead, in hopes that the predator or the threat loses interest and goes away. Or they may engage in the fawn response, which oftentimes involves immediately moving to try to please and appease the person or the threat to avoid any conflict. This is almost like a dog rolling on its back for a more aggressive dog in hopes that its show of submission will quell the aggression of the other dog. This is often a response that's developed in childhood trauma, where a parent or significant authority figure is the abuser. Traumatized individuals go into a fawn-like response to attempt to avoid the abuse by being a pleaser. In other words, they preemptively attempt to appease the abuser by agreeing, answering what they know the abuser wants to hear, or by ignoring their personal feelings and desires to do anything and everything to prevent the abuse. The survivor may bargain, saying yes to the parts that they can endure, telling themselves that the experiences were not violations, that they weren't that bad, or attempting to restore the experience after it has happened. Once again, these are all normal responses to trauma. Sometimes when we offer help and support and resources to someone we care about or someone that we perceive to be in an unsafe situation, it can feel frustrating when those offers of help are denied or brushed off or taken from a perspective of ill intention. However, we have to be mindful that that victim or that survivor in front of us is probably dealing with a lot of feelings that we can't see, a lot of invisible barriers and emotions on top of the trauma responses that is absolutely going to impact how they respond to offers of help. And we know that from those feelings come behaviors or what we see. Maybe that person is feeling overwhelmed and they're having a trauma response. So therefore they cannot emotionally regulate or they cannot utilize their higher functioning decision-making skills and they're overwhelmed by all of your questions. Maybe you resemble their perpetrator or their abuser. So your genuine offers of help and support may be activating their trauma. Maybe they just don't feel comfortable talking about their situation because maybe they don't know you very well, or maybe they're just skeptical about how long your offers of help will last. Maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing those intimate details of their relationship because they're worried about judgment and embarrassment or shame. Maybe they love and care about their abuser and they don't want them to get in trouble. So they're cautious to talk to you or tell you the full story. And maybe they don't perceive their situation as dangerous and they don't perceive themselves as a victim. So your help may be perceived as offensive. We cannot assume that someone is in a place, emotionally, physically, or mentally, where they are able to accept our help. And we also can't assume that they're in a safe enough place to take that help. We also have to remember that trauma completely overwhelms our capacity to utilize our coping skills. It floods that road to rational thought. It impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, process reactions, problem solve, and utilize our higher level decision-making skills. So these responses that we see here on this outer ring are oftentimes common, but also very hurtful, harmful responses to trauma. And when we respond in this way, that is only going to impact the behavior, which is then going to impact the feelings, which is then going to exacerbate the trauma. Plus, we are not the only ones putting blame and shame on the victim and the survivor, as they are also putting that blame and shame on themselves. And when that trauma settles in a few days and their brains and bodies are able to re-regulate, that's when all the coulda, shoulda, and wouldas set in for them. If a victim or a survivor is seeking help and support, maybe even for the very first time, and they are met with those responses, they are met with blame, shame, and doubt, how likely will they be to seek support and help the next time? We also don't know the potentially complex trauma that has happened before this specific instance. Each time a person experiences trauma, it makes it harder and harder for the body to re-regulate back to its normal functioning before the traumas occurred. What we have to remember is that behind every story and experience of trauma, there is a real person. This is art that was created by a survivor who is utilizing our services. As you look at the drawing, you may describe the girl as small, exposed, and vulnerable, and you may see that monster, and it's big and it's scary. This is how she drew her trauma, something that took up a lot of room in her life. It takes up a lot of room on this piece of paper. But even in the face of the big and scary trauma, the girl is still standing, and she is facing it. This is actually a picture of resiliency. Our brains are elastic and resilient. Research shows that it takes 2 to 3 years for the brain to heal from the changes that take place as a result of trauma. The brain needs time, support, and resources. Changing the brain takes effort, repetition, and time. People facing trauma need to feel safe, to not feel pressure, to be able to express their emotions, to know what is happening next, to not feel judged, and to have access to safe, supportive, and trusting people. We do not expect you to be an expert in providing advocacy services to victims and survivors of trauma. But what we do expect is that you start to implement ways that you can create a safe and calm environment for the survivors that you come in contact with, a space that is free from shame, blame, doubt, and judgment. We also expect you to work with your local domestic violence agency. Lean on that agency for support when you aren't sure what to do. Refer to that agency often. One of the most crucial things that we can do is hold space and listen. Not listen to respond or listen to fix, but listen to hear. Allow the time and the space for the survivor to process without asking a lot of questions, without giving a lot of advice or jumping to solutions. Hear what they want and need. Hear how they see their situation. And they may refuse your help or deny that anything is occurring, and that is okay. Understand that that can be really frustrating, but sometimes we just have to pocket that frustration because we have to understand that the moment is about the survivor, not about us. And even if the survivor rejects the offer for assistance, you have supported them by affirming some of their feelings. You have also opened the door for a confidential conversation in the future. Following the survivor's lead, you can offer practical assistance and a different point of view. Understand that as an outsider looking into this situation, you are probably seeing it differently and perceiving it differently than the person who is directly experiencing the violence and the abuse. Remember, trauma and the way that we respond to trauma is all about perception. Let them know that when and if they are ready, there is help available. Keep brochures and hotline cards on hand for people who may need advocacy support services. If they are ready to seek help, you could offer to call the hotline for them or even accompany them to the agency. Thank you so much for tuning into this session of Neurobiology of Trauma. The more that we understand the lasting impacts of trauma, the more able we are to provide services and care that will be helpful and effective. If you are concerned about your relationship, or if you want to help a friend or loved one, or maybe you just have questions and want to talk, advocates are available 24/7 via our free and confidential helpline at 1-888-822-2983. To learn more about our services and to connect with our mission, please visit our website at www.ywcanek.org or our social media pages. We do not do this work alone. Our power comes from the women, children, families, and survivors we serve, and the generosity and support from our community.